In his book Barbarian Way, Irwin talks about critters and zoologists group animals with official names. Like, what do you call a bunch of birds? Flock. How about whales? Pod. Yeah. How about deer? Yeah. Okay. Well, how about specific birds? How about crows? Oh, now it's getting a little interesting, right? Yeah. Get this. And we're in a church. You know what you call a gathering of vultures? Hungry, yeah. 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 And now I'm not making this up. This is what zoologists classify. A grouping of vultures is called a committee. How do you like them apples, right? Now, rhinos can run 30 miles an hour. But here's what's interesting. They can only see 30 feet in front of them. So picture a 2-ton critter who can run 30 miles an hour, but can only see 30 feet in front of them. You know what they call a group of rhinos? No joke. A crash. A crash of rhinos. But I bring all this up to talk about what you call a gathering of tigers. And tigers don't actually like to gather, but they have a specific way they attack. And so when there's a gathering of tigers, they have a real specific name. You see, the interesting thing about tigers is they primarily want to attack prey from behind. In fact, in tiger-infested areas, some of the indigenous people who know what they're doing in the bush will wear masks on the back of their head to try and discourage the tiger, right? Because a group of tigers is called an ambush. Now, I was living in South Florida in a town called Loxahatchee, out in the woods. And I had a neighbor. First time I met this neighbor, it wasn't a great experience. I was at the local flea market. And he was like an attraction at the flea market. Just like, not like the flea market was built around the guy. He's just like one of the booths. You know what I'm saying? But he was in a loincloth. And he had a chimpanzee. Not like a real chimpanzee. Okay? And you could go up to, his name's Steve Sippick. You could go up to Steve and pay him some money, which is why he was there. And you could get a picture with the chimp, right? And I later found out I was Steve Seppick's neighbor. Now, not like next door neighbor, and you're going to find out why that would have been significant, because Steve had played Tarzan in some B movies. Go ahead and Google it, Steve Sippick, S-I-P-E-K if you want, right? And he's an eccentric dude. And had a compound. And this is very rural, okay? And he had some big cats on his compound. And the legend goes, and this I can't verify, it's only legend, that there was a big cat, a lion, who had chewed some rope when a stunt had gone bad that involved pyrotechnics, and it saved Steve from getting burned. So he kept that lion. But I know for certain he had a tiger named Bobo. And he had some volunteers come to help paint Bobo's enclosure. Now, this was Boynton Beach news, okay? I read it in the newspaper, and then I certainly heard about it in my town. He told the lady who was going to be painting the fence in the enclosure where the tiger is, and don't picture a zoo. Like this is like lots of brush, lots of palmetto bushes, lots of cover. And he said, okay, I'm going to go in and get some supplies, but don't go in the tiger enclosure without me. I even got the lady's name. In fact, I think we're probably intimate enough of a proximity that you can see this. This is Steve, and this is Bobo. Can you see him? And yet, if you check the guy's face out, he kind of has a little bit of a Tarzan look, but this is like Tarzan closer to the grave stage of life. You know what I'm saying? And here's what the lady wrote. I wouldn't tell the story if she died, because, I got a heart. But she was 72. And she testifies to the newspaper, I heard the crunching of bone. And I didn't know anything was going to happen until I heard the crunching of skull. See, Steve went in the house, and guess what this lady did? She went in the cage. Here's why. She looked in the cage and said, there's no tiger in there. And then helped herself into the cage. And here's, what do you call a group of tigers? Bobo waited until she walked past and deep into the enclosure, and then he attacked her from behind. I don't want to put, Matt, you look self-secure. So Bobo grabbed right here and crunched her skull. Steve, a.k.a. Tarzan, to the rescue, hears this blood-curdling scream and comes running out and calls Bobo off, and the lady gets life-flighted. She lives, okay? This was while I was living in Loxahatchee. I moved away from Loxahatchee to be a pastor in a different town, but I turned on the news in my new town, and it said, local man's tiger escapes property in Palm Beach County. Local sheriffs put Bobo the tiger down for fear of the community's safety. So poor Bobo didn't get any more skulls to crunch. Now there's a reason I'm telling you all about this tiger, because here's what Irwin claimed in his book, Barbarian Way. You got one lion and you got one tiger, and the tiger's going to win the fight. Now, of course, if it's a juvenile, all things being equal, a tiger's going to put a lion down. But you got 5 tigers and you got 5 lions. The lions win the fight every time, because lions move in a pride and they coordinate their attacks together. So one tiger, one lion, the tiger's going to win the fight. 5 tigers, 5 lions, the lions are going to win the fight. Unless tigers can learn to unite. Now here's the thing. James just said 5 weeks of discipleship group. So in a minute, we're going to dig into God's word, but here's what I want you to think about. What does it look like to chase after God on your own and work through your problems on your own and pray on your own and try and get by with the pressures from work and family? But what does it look like to move with others towards God, like when tigers unite? I think it's a game changer. And I think we've got a narrative in the scripture that kind of shows how beautiful it can be when just a few dare and others join. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 13. And really, it's just 3 simple ideas: the problem, the solution, and the results. But the problem's pretty significant, fellas. Here's the problem. Saul is king of God's people. They have enemies called the Philistines. And in light of this massive Philistine army, the Israelites start to get a little nervous. In fact, Saul picked a fight. So if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 13, I'm going to start at verse 1. I want you to see this fight that Saul picks. Saul was 40 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 32 years over Israel. Now Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash, and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. But he sent away the rest of the people, each to his tent. And Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and also that the Israelites had become, catch this phrase, New American Standard Version, odious to the Philistines. And the reason I say Saul's picking a fight is because Saul had 2,000 men, Jonathan had 1,000 men, and yeah, they did some damage to some outposts. But look at the next paragraph. How many Philistines got aroused through the irritant of a gnat called Israel? Now verse 5. Now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen. And when it comes to the infantry, it just says, and people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. Now, imagine you're one of those Israelites, and you start, what did C-3PO say to Han Solo? And what did Han Solo say? But never tell me the odds. That's what Han Solo said to C-3PO. Hey, man, if you don't know Star Wars, just get with it, man. Some of the Hebrews started calculating the odds. And what the scriptures end up telling us is a number of Saul's men fled into the hills and hid. We're going to find out later that not only did some go hide in the hills, but some, like, which side am I on? The side that's winning, right? So some of them went and joined the Philistines. Another problem that accentuates the situation, the Philistines had, in a clever way, made certain that there was a shortage. Verse 19. Now no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "Lest the Hebrews make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare and his mattocks and his axe and his hoe. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and mattocks, and forks and axes to fix the hoes. So it came about on the day of battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan. But they were with Saul and his son Jonathan. And in a minute, we're going to see how many men are left. In the army Saul has with them, there are 600 men. And out of the 600 men, there are, count them, 2 swords. 2 swords. I'd say that's a pretty legitimate problem. Now, the problems even get a little worse because I think ultimately the problem is Saul is off mission. But Saul's nervous, and so he starts trying to come up with his own solutions. And so as we're still in chapter 13, I want you to see verse 12. Now, therefore, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked for the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered burnt offerings. Now, he was king, but it was not his role to offer sacrifices. It was Samuel's role, but Saul couldn't find Samuel. And so he just did his own thing. And Samuel ain't too happy about it. Look at what, as it continues, and Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom forever over Israel, but now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Well, that's the picture of the problem. You got a king off mission. You got a God who's not too happy with that king. You got 3,000 men who quickly added up to 600 men. You got an army that numbers the seashore, and you got 2 swords. Now, I want you for real to take just a minute and put yourself in that situation and what you think you might do. Because sometimes we can read what's in the Bible and forget this is actually real. This is telling us something that actually happened. Because I really like Jonathan. And I am blown away by what I see Jonathan present as a solution. And I think we could learn something from what Jonathan says and does. Look at verse 1 of 1 Samuel 14. Now the day came that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come, let us cross over to the Philistine garrison that is on yonder side." But he did not tell his father. And Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron, and the people who were with him were about what? 600. Jump down to verse 4. Or even the sentence before verse 4. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. And between the passes by which Jonathan sought to cross over to the Philistine garrison, there was a sharp crag on one side and a sharp crag on the other side. And the name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Sinna. One crag rose on the north opposite Michmash, the other on the south opposite Gibeah. So here's the picture. There on one side, there's a deep ravine separating them with 2 huge crags. Then you got this massive army on this side, 600 people sitting under a pomegranate tree. And then you got Jonathan, his armor bearer. Between the 2 of them, how many swords you got? 1, because the other sword is Saul's. Here's what happens in verse 6. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, here's the solution. Here's the plan. Come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Now, when he's referring to them as the uncircumcised, he's referencing them as not the people of God, as those without a covenant with God. See, when he references them as the uncircumcised, there is a bit of an insult, but it's not a racial insult. It's really a category of whose God they serve versus whose God Jonathan serves. And we're going to see how Jonathan is inspired to take a faith-filled risk because of his God in his explanation. Come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us. Did you catch that phrase? Some translations. Somebody have it in another other than NASB? I would love to hear somebody read out loud 1 Samuel chapter 14 and the second half of verse 6 in a different translation. Yeah.
Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us.
When I heard Erwin preach from this text to the entire Alliance family, he said, I literally had a t-shirt made just to make the point. It said on the front, the Lord will work for us. And on the back it said, maybe. Now I want you to think about this for a second. You got the 3 Hebrew youth, right? Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we will not bow down. Hey, if you don't bow down, you're going to the fiery furnace. Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, our God will rescue us from the fiery furnace. But here's the best line of Daniel. But even if he does not, we will not bow down. Here's what I want you to see, because I think it's a decision that will be faced by men who are tasked with leading the church, leading their families, leading their communities. some things God's just worthy of. Some things are worthwhile even if you don't know the outcome. Some things warrant a sacrifice that lays it on the line before you know what the immediate consequence might be. And here's why men of God can make faith-filled risks. Hear me out. Here's why. Because we've got a book that is inerrant, infallible, and inspired. It's a supernatural book. We can trust what it says from the author of all things. And when I turn to the back, I read, when all's said and done, we win. Survival's not the goal. Comfort certainly isn't the goal. Preference isn't the goal. God's glory is the goal. And how cool could it be to slide into heaven on fire, bloody, and the blood stain of your body points the direction we're supposed to go. And you roll into the pearly gates smoldering saying, wow, what a ride. Now you think that might be theoretical. I've got a friend who lives in Indianapolis. And he's kind of a counterpart to the job that I do. But this guy, Bob Petty, has been to India numerous times. And it's a different world. And on one occasion, I got to meet one of his friends from India, an Indian man who loves to share the gospel with villages. But where he shares the gospel in these villages, there is horrific persecution. And I got to be in a seminar all week with this guy, Trevor. He was just visiting, so he just sat in on the seminar trying to train pastors on how to plant churches. And Trevor was just there checking it out, and he's taking notes, but there was something different about this guy. And I remember after an event, I think they like food really hot and spicy in India. And I think he's quite capable of eating very spicy food. And there was a wing place just next door to where we were meeting. And so a group about 11 of us went to this wing place. And Trevor started speaking Hindi to one of the guys in the kitchen. And that guy started brewing up like a back home mix of wings. You understand what I'm talking about? And they brought it out and we all had our burning hot, and they laugh, right? And Trevor's eating these wings, and they're super hot. And next thing I know, he goes back in the kitchen, and he's just talking to these guys. And he didn't have the hairnet on, you know what I mean? He's just doing it, and they're eating it up, and they're talking about sauces, and they're talking about their villages, and the next thing you know, he starts sharing the love of God with them, and I'm like, are you even kidding me? We're going to have a revival service in this wing joint. But here's the thing that really stuck with me. Trevor didn't tell a lot of people this, but Bob, who's my close friend, told me about this, and now I believe James is recording this, so maybe a whole bunch of other people hear about it, and that's not my intent. Bob said, Dave, what you don't know was at one point when Trevor was visiting, he slid his smartphone over to me, and his face was grave. And he said, Brother Bob, I want you to look at those pictures. And Bob picked up the pictures. And it was one after another of Indian men who follow Jesus with hatchets or clubs or some bloody means of bringing about their end, because they took the gospel where it was not welcome. And Trevor said, Brother Bob, we just know when we go into the next village, we begin to look for our escape routes, because eventually word will get out that we're there and somebody's going to come put an end to it. And I'm telling you this, hear me. Denominations rise and fall. Schools of institutions of learning, they rise and fall. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, they were founded to train clergy to preach the Word of God at their beginnings. I don't think that's their primary objective today. I'm an Eagle Scout. My son's in the Air Force. I would consider myself patriotic. I will tell you this, men of Shelby Alliance, nations rise and fall. Ask Assyria. Ask Babylon. Ask Persia. Ask Greece. Ask Rome. Mighty empires come and go. Now, I think we are privileged with immense freedoms. I don't know for how much longer. And I'm not sure which way the wind's going to blow. But it may be the case that there will come a time when meeting publicly is not allowed. And the weapons of our warfare are divinely powerful for destroying fortresses, not weapons used against men of flesh in defense or retaliation. Hear me. This isn't a prepper talk, okay? You follow what I'm saying? But weapons that are divinely powerful. Weapons like love, sacrifice, courage, surrender, obedience, prayer. Erwin's son went to a Christian camp. And you go to a non-Christian camp and they tell ghost stories. You go to a Christian camp and they tell demon stories. So this 8-year-old kid comes home pretty scared. And he's having nightmares. So he calls his dad into his room. And he says, Dad, I want you to pray for me. And I want you to pray that I'd be safe. And Erwin is responsible for discipling this young man, his own son. He says, son, I'm not going to pray that you'd be safe. Now, you can imagine the look on this little boy's face. Right? Like, call Child Protective Services. He said, but I am going to pray for you. And son, here's what I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray that you'd be dangerous. Not safe. Dangerous. Dangerous to the kingdom of darkness. Dangerous to the forces arrayed against God. So I like fighting. Didn't put that on my resume to become district superintendent. But I like martial arts. Concealed carry permit holder. I like shooting. Kind of into the fight. One day I was praying with a mentor. His name's John Curlin. Picture Yoda. He's like 80. He's a retired doctor. He's a pretty small dude. Really wise. Man, basically you and I like Star Wars in this room, and that is about it. If you don't know what Yoda looks like, Google it. Good night. Okay. Not an impressive appearance. And I'm praying with this guy, John, and he's pretty good at praying. By this time, he had retired from his job, and he just kind of traveled around teaching people how to pray. And I was being developed as a leader, and they sicked John Curlin on me. And he says, Dave, I'm going to pray for you. But as I've been praying for you, I don't think this motif of the fight that you got going on, I don't think it's from God. And I'm like, oh yeah? You want to fight about it? No, I didn't say that. I said, well, what are we going to do, John? He goes, well, let's see what the Lord has to say. And that was the kind of faith this dude in his 80s prayed with. So John Curlin prayed and he said, Lord, what do you want Dave to know about the fight? And let me tell you what I saw. It stunned me. I saw in my mind's eye an image of Roman soldiers crucifying Jesus. He is laying on his back, his arms are spread, and they're nailing his hands and his feet to the cross. And I'm stunned by the image that I'm imagining. And I say to John, John, I don't understand it, but I can see them crucifying Jesus. And this is what John Kirtland said to me. Tell me, Dave, is he fighting? And I said, no, he's not fighting. He said, does he look helpless? I said, no, he doesn't look helpless. It looks like he's disarming sin and death and hell. And he goes, how is he disarming sin and death and hell? I said, through obedience, through sacrifice, through love. And then John Kirtland said this, you know why the Lord showed you that picture, Dave? Because you don't have to fight. You know why you don't have to fight? Because the Lord's won the fight already. You just go out there and be a messenger announcing the victory. Well, we need to wrap up. Let's see how this plan works. He says, and I'll summarize it. He says, Jonathan to his armor bearer, here's the deal. Now I'm thinking, you go stealth, man. There's only two of you. You wait till they're sleeping. You slit their throats in their sleep, right? No, that's not what they do. He goes, here's the plan. We'll go to the bottom of the crag and we'll look up at them and we'll call out to them. And here's his idea. If they come down to us, then that will be the case. But if they call us up to them, that will be a sign that God is delivering them into our hands. The Lord will work for us. Maybe. Perhaps. But the next line says, for whether we are many or we are few, the Lord is able to save. Now here's what's fascinating. The text says that they climbed up the crag with their hands and feet, which seems like a superfluous detail until you really think about it. That means the entire time they're climbing, the sword is not in Jonathan's hand. And if you think Jonathan is courageous, the armor bearer carries the sword until it's needed. And here's what happens. Radical faith-filled risk. It says, and can you just trust me to paraphrase it without reading it? It says, when they reached the top, there was an earthquake that the Lord started. And as the earthquake hits, and hear me, when our faith dares to take a risk, and our trust converges with the risk, that often becomes the epicenter of God's activity. And an earthquake was the manifestation of God's activity. And it says that the earthquake created confusion such that the Philistines started killing one another. Now here's what's really cool. All he's got to wait for is one Philistine to die, and now the armor bearer has a sword, and Jonathan has a sword. I remember my martial arts instructor, speaking of preppers, and if there are some in the room, please forgive me. I'm not picking on you. But my martial arts instructor was, because he said, Dave, I don't store up ammo. And I said, why not, Mr. Robert? He goes, I just need one bullet. Then all their bullets are my bullets. I was like, okay, Mr. Robert, remind me not to cross you and to obey you in class. He just needed one Philistine to die. Now the armor bearer has a sword. But here's what's amazing. It says that the Hebrews who had betrayed the cause of the Lord were inspired by the courage of Jonathan and the armor bearer, and they return to the side of the Hebrews. Oh, army's growing. Starts off 2, throw in an earthquake. That's a pretty big game changer. In the military, they call it a force multiplier. Then the courage of the 2 inspired the traitors to return to the cause. Reinforcement wave number 3, earthquake, traitors. There's a ruckus. And the men hiding in the hills hear the ruckus and look and see that the battle has ensued and join the battle. And then Saul says, I hear a battle. Looks like all 600 of us are here. Take a head count. Now, I imagine if Fred was the dude that had left, Saul would be like, okay, let's just keep listening here. But when they do a head count, they say, Saul, your son is missing. So guess what Saul does with his 600 men? He joins the battle. And hear me, the Philistines are thwarted. And that day, the Hebrews gain victory. So here's what I want you to think about. What does it look like when tigers unite? What does it look like that as long as you're moving 2 tons at 30 miles an hour, it sort of doesn't matter what's ahead? In fact, listen to this line, and then we're almost done. This is an excerpt from that book I told you, The Barbarian Way. Although the force of one person fully committed to God is tremendous, it pales in comparison to the force of God's people moving together. One barbarian wandering through civilization can be discarded as nothing more than an oddity, unless it's Conan. But when members of a barbarian tribe line up across the battlefield side by side, something amazing begins to happen. Dark kingdoms tremble. Dungeons and prisons that hold men, women, and children captive crumble. Prison doors open. Chains unlock. Multitudes come to freedom. Whenever the barbarians of Christ pass through civilization, the oppressed and forgotten are soon found dancing in the streets. Shelby, I believe there is a mission before you, and I believe that it is the task of the men to lead the cause of that mission. And I believe there are people in this community, in this county, that are bound up and lost and discouraged and hopeless. And you've already got the news that we win, and you've been tasked with a message to let the world know that we've won. And to invite the hurting and the lost and the wandering. Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's your coworker. Maybe it's a relative you're currently estranged from. And maybe it's a task that you don't have a sword for. But maybe as tigers unite, and maybe as men come together, and you find encouragement in one another, and a sword sharpens another sword as iron sharpens iron, maybe, just maybe, it will create an epicenter of God's activity that this community can't ignore. And you think that might be pie in the sky. I'll tell you, there were 8 people praying in a house with a man named Albert Benjamin Simpson, and it started a movement of gospel saturation, and now there's 1 million people in Vietnam. There's nearly that in the Philippines. There's 2,000 churches here in the States that all have DNA just from that one movement. And that's just one ship in the armada of God's fleet. And you're a part of it. And you are tasked with writing this chapter of the story of the church. So go be the church. Let's pray.